A Second Amendment ruling changes everything in the pistol brace ban debate. Plus, USCCA's political director explains her vision for the group's new action fund. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. We send you one email a week if you're a free member that has everything you need to know, I think, stuff you are not going to find anywhere else. And then, of course, you can also buy a membership if you want even more, if you want to get access to our analysis, to our member exclusive pieces, and you want to support the reporting we do here as an independent and informed publication. This week on the show, we are talking about a story that we actually had an exclusive on recently, the formation of a new political group by a major gun rights operation, the United States Concealed Carry Association. You probably know them as USCCA. And we have with us today the executive director of their new action fund, Katie Pointer Baney, who is joining the show for the first time. Welcome to the show, Katie.
Hey, Stephen. Thanks for having me on. Great to be here. Always great to chat with you.
Yes. I appreciate you making the time to give us some insight into this new group and I guess a bit of USCCA's overall strategy with political maneuverings, right? This is not the first group you guys have funded, but what is the new group? Tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. So the USCCA for Saving Lives Action Fund is a new 501c4 organization that we have launched. Really, we're doing this in response to our membership. As you know, the USCCA is a membership organization. Hopefully, listeners who are tuned in are USCCA members. We have over 800,000 folks across the country nationwide who are members. And what we heard from them is really this desire, need for us to get a little bit more involved in the political advocacy space, help them, really equip them with the tools, the education, and the resources necessary to get involved in the political process. And that's really what we're doing through the Action Fund. We're trying to energize and engage gun owners to participate in the process, but have the tools and know where to start. I think a lot of folks look at our current political environment with sort of dismay, with frustration, and they don't know where to begin. They don't know where to start. And what the Action Fund wants to do and provide are, again, those sort of concrete steps that individuals can take in their local communities at the state level and at the federal level to influence the political process, to influence policymakers, and ultimately with the goal of promoting and safeguarding the Second Amendment for generations to come.
Okay. And so, it sounds like the 501c3 aspect of this new group, the Action Fund, is something that you want to use to train activists, perhaps, like train people to go from being a gun owner to being a gun rights activist. Is that sort of the gist of the approach here?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to phrase it. We also talk a lot about citizen lobbyist, because a lot of organizations in the 2A political space, they're going to be raising funds, asking for money, paying for lobbyists to then influence the process. And while I think that's one strategy, that's one approach, it's an important piece of the puzzle, it's not everything. We want to equip gun owners to be the best influencers and representatives, and again, the citizen lobbyists that they can be in order to safeguard the Second Amendment. Because I think in order to do this for generations to come, we have to influence the millions of new gun owners that we have over the past couple of years. We have to influence our neighbors and our friends. We have to change the perception of gun ownership. And that really starts through grassroots activation. That starts with everyday American gun owners. That starts with USCCA members, and really providing them with the scripts and the tools and the education necessary to do that, to be a voice, to participate in the process.
Okay. And so what are a few of the specific things you have planned for this particular group, this Action Fund? What are the kinds of events you're going to hold? I know you had a protest, right, during the New Mexico governor's attempt to essentially ban concealed carry in the state's largest city. What does this look like in practice for you?
We'll have to talk a little bit about that, because what happened in New Mexico was a great example and case study of the grassroots activation that we want to see really across the country. So I'd love to thank the USCCA members that showed up. We had over 150 people really show up to like a rally press conference. We brought together state legislators, local law enforcement. We partnered with one of our official partners, Caliber Shooting Range in New Mexico, to host the event. And again, this was a focus on community. It was a focus on bringing people together to have a forum and to have a conversation about the New Mexico governor's order, about why it's clearly and blatantly unconstitutional, and showing a sort of force of gun ownership of saying we're not going to tolerate this sort of intrusion on the Second Amendment, and providing that forum, providing that community, doing all of the marketing and the work apparatus to get folks there, and then ensuring we had media coverage. We had all three of the major local networks there covering it, of showing responsible gun owners out, having this conversation, talking with local leaders and about what the next steps were going to be to challenge the New Mexico governor's order, which of course, as you know, has been put on hold, and she's retracted pieces of it. So that was really a great case study. We were really happy with the success of that event. And that's an event that we would like to replicate across the country, really empowering people in that community to show up, to get involved, to make their voice heard on a variety of, legislative and political issues facing the Second Amendment. So that's a really great kind of example of the sorts of events and in-person experiences that we want to host and to really bring gun owners together on. I would say we're also going to be looking ahead to the 2024 election and other events such as get out the vote registration campaigns. I want to make sure all new gun owners are registered to vote and that they think about their Second Amendment rights when they're going into the ballot box. If you've bought a firearm over the past couple of years to protect yourself, to protect your family, then make sure you use your vote, your voice, to ensure that that right is protected, because there are plenty of politicians and lawmakers who don't believe you should have that fundamental right to self-defense, that don't believe you should be able to own a firearm. And so it's part of that educational tour, that informative tour, providing them with the tools, getting them registered, making sure everyone understands really what's at stake in 2024. And this will be in addition to a lot of the events that the USCCA already does across the country. We'll do some of them in conjunction with the USCCA, free training and education seminars at official partners, ranges, and retailers, again, providing that sort of community for gun owners to come together, to have these conversations, and to feel like they're a part of the process.
Okay. You just talked a little bit there about new gun owners, right? This sort of idea of gun culture 2.0. Seeing more women, more minorities, more urban and suburban gun owners, people with different interests from hunting, perhaps, right? Joining the gun owning, community. It sounds like you're focused a lot on them, and this was true when we spoke earlier. Is that one of your differentiators? Is something that you think is going to set you apart in how you approach this issue? Obviously, there's a lot of gun rights groups out there. There's a lot doing, rallies and political activism. There's bigger groups than you guys, the NRA being an obvious one, doing this stuff. So what is that? How you plan to set yourself apart? What are the unique things that you guys are bringing to the table here?
When we look at the 2A political space, and again, what we have heard from our members is there are a lot of 2A political groups, and I think a lot of groups that are doing really good work. Second Amendment Foundation and other groups launching legal challenges, for example. That's not something that the USCCA plans on operating in, but we think that's great work and, want to partner and continue to see those organizations do that. I don't see, and we didn't see a ton of investment in gun owners, this sort of grassroots activation piece. I think that's what's currently missing in this whole conversation. We see a lot of focus in the legal space, rightfully so. We're having some success there. We obviously saw a win in the Supreme Court last year with the Bruin decision. The legal landscape is important, and I think there's a lot of great work being done there. I don't see a lot of great work being done in the grassroots space. I don't see a ton of investment in the average gun owner, teaching them how again, to be these sorts of citizen lobbyists and to be the best advocates for themselves, for responsible gun ownership. And it's really true to the mantra of the USCCA. We teach our members to be responsible gun owners. We talk a lot about personal responsibility. What the Action Fund and what our political advocacy efforts are going to focus on is your individual civic responsibility, that ultimately we get the government we deserve. And that's a hard pill to swallow. And if you are uncomfortable or frustrated, dismayed at the current political environment, it's up to you to stand up and get involved in your local community, state, federal level, wherever it may be, and participate. And what we don't see is a ton of empowerment and investment there. And that's really where the USCCA wants to live. It's where we want to focus. We want to teach gun owners how to be their own best advocates, be the best representatives they can be for gun ownership. Again, because if we're going to protect and safeguard the Second Amendment for generations to come with millions of new gun owners, we have to change the perception of gun ownership. We have to fight this overarching media narrative that gun owners are evil or that a firearm is inherently dangerous. It's an uphill battle. And so I think that really starts at the ground level organically through grassroots.
Okay. And how do you plan to approach sort of the political realities surrounding guns? Obviously, we're in this very polarized era, and guns in particular have become a very partisan issue where essentially there are very few pro-gun Democrats left, at least at the national level. And it's really become an issue that's completely captured by the Republican Party as far as, advocacy goes. Like how do you deal with that? And, even extending beyond the national level to the state level, you see a lot of extreme polarization there where gun laws are radically different once you cross state borders in some areas. What are your plans to operate in this sort of era that we've found ourselves in?
I would say this is idealistic and this is optimistic, and we recognize that gun ownership shouldn't be political. It shouldn't, and it shouldn't be partisan. The Second Amendment is the guiding founding principle document of our country. All elected officials take an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. The Second Amendment is part of that. The fundamental right to self-defense really shouldn't be partisan. That continues to be what the USCCA believes and what we say to our members. And Stephen, we have a lot of members across the political spectrum who identify as Democrat, Republican, Green Party, Libertarian, Independents. And so we want to start there. Foundationally, fundamentally, we don't believe this should be a partisan issue. Now, to your point, there are political realities, right, that in this environment, it is hotly contested, it is polarized. And so we'll continue to work with anyone who wants to have a conversation about the fundamental right to self-defense, who's willing to stand up and protect the Second Amendment. If that's Republicans, if that's Democrats, great. But we want to be welcoming to sort of that whole political spectrum, recognizing likely the majority, especially of elected leaders in this country, are going to identify as Republicans. But I think we need to take a step back and recognize that this really shouldn't be a partisan issue. And we certainly saw over the past 2 years, gun ownership cut across all political ideologies, cut across all races, all demographics, all age groups. So it isn't, we understand it's optimistic and idealistic, but still believe that this really shouldn't be partisan.
Yeah, I mean, because, and I think I would just want to dig in here a little bit more on this, because you look at a group like the NRA, right? It has millions of members, even still today, even with the struggles it's gone through across the entire country. And they do talk about, at times, supporting anyone who supports their mission. But at the same time, you see from them, and it's not just the NRA, you see this with a lot of single issue advocacy groups. The ACLU would be another sort of prime example of this, where there seems to be a calculation that a certain demographic of donors, essentially, or members, is much more profitable, or you're able to get more revenue out of them by appealing to all sorts of issues that have really not much to do with firearms, but are partisan issues as well. You've seen the NRA do ads that talk about immigration, that talk about vaccine mandates, things of that nature. You've seen the ACLU go well outside of civil liberties issues into other sort of liberal identity issues as well. And that kind of speaks to perhaps the political realities that we're in. Again, like maybe it's more advantageous to try and raise more revenue from your core group of supporters than it is to try to get it from people on the fence of an issue. It seems to be a strategic calculation going on there. Why don't you think that's the right approach, or why do you prefer the one that you just articulated here? Why do you think that will be better?
I think the other approaches you've outlined are short-sighted and a lack of discipline at the end of the day. The USCCA has very clear guiding core principles and mission, and we intend not to stray from that we really are talking about the fundamental right to self-defense, that a firearm is one of the best tools to protect yourself, protect your family, that we are trying to create safer communities for all people, and that we believe their individuals have a civic responsibility to get involved in the political process. And I think, again, it's a focus on being very clear on what our mission is, what our core values are, and what we want to accomplish for our membership.
Okay. And extending from that to, there's this sort of state level question from earlier here. Obviously, you're going to have a much harder time of pursuing pro-gun policies in a place like California than you are in a place like Alabama or Texas or Georgia or what have you. How do you guys approach that issue? Like, how are you rationing out your resources to have the most impact?
I think we still need to have conversations in California. We still need to have conversations in hard places, or in quote unquote really blue places that might be hostile when we're talking about gun ownership and this fundamental right. It doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't be having those conversations. We will. In terms of a strategic allocation of resources, we do take really seriously. We have a ton of individual, thousands of donors from across the country, supporters to our political advocacy efforts. These are your listeners and everyday gun owners who are giving on average, $20, $25. And we take that financial stewardship really seriously, the responsibility that you have opened up your wallet and have trusted us with that. And so how do we be the best stewards possible of those resources, and how do we make really key strategic decisions and investments in specific states where we think we're going to make the biggest difference? We're in the process of identifying that, especially over the next year. And when we're thinking about 2024, the race, of course, for president, but there are many down ballot races that are also going to have a considerable impact, where gun owners are, where they're living, what states, where can we activate them in, where is it most critical to do so. We're going to continue that sort of evaluation again to make sure we are being the best stewards of the resources that we can.
Okay. And let's get to the resources part of this, because that's what makes, I think, USCCA's entrance into the political realm, or, it's not your first group, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but this effort that you guys are putting forth in a more serious manner, really interesting. You talked about having 800,000 members earlier, and what, every group talks about how they have hundreds of thousands of members. The difference, I think, between, every town's claimed number of members, or some of the other gun rights groups' claimed number of members, and you guys and the NRA perhaps are the fact that your members pay money to be members. They're dues paying members, which I think is a massive distinction to like a list of emails, that you sign up to follow the newsletter of a group. It's not the same thing as signing up to pay them money to be a member. And so obviously 800,000 is not 5 million. It's not even, 4.5 million or whatever the NRA is currently claiming at this point. They still have a much larger advantage over you. And, they're still at their peak. They were like a $400 million organization between all the groups that they have set up. That's a huge hole to fill if they're not going to get back to that level. And they don't seem like they're going to get back to that level anytime soon. So, what realistically can you guys do on this front to plug that hold to increase even beyond where the NRA was at its peak in 2016 or whatever?
Well, we know we have upwards of 20 plus million gun owners in America. So the opportunity, the market share is huge here. And of course, USCCA members are paying us. The benefit from them, of course, is our world-class firearm training, education, and our self-defense liability insurance. And that's what people look to and for when they come to the USCCA. In addition to that, when we're talking about the Action Fund and the other political organizations and advocacy groups that we are launching, we're doing this really, again, as a response to that membership base, they're looking around, they're consumers, they see the 2A sort of political landscape, and they're saying, we want an alternative. We want another group that we can trust with our resources in order to fight and protect the Second Amendment. And of course, the foundation of our business is the Second Amendment and is this fundamental right to self-defense. And it is, of course, in our best interest and in the best interest of our members that we safeguard this and promote it. So we believe there's a huge opportunity here to continue to grow membership in the USCCA, but then, of course, support for our political advocacy efforts across the country, whether USCCA members or not.
Yeah, and I guess that works into the next question I have here pretty well, and that is with the structure of the organization, right? Most political groups, it's not, so now you have a 501c3, you already had a Super PAC.
A C4.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
C4. And that's very common for serious political players to have multiple legal entities, right? So that you can do different things with different entities. A Super PAC can do things a certain way, like unlimited independent expenditures and fundraising, but it has limitations on coordinating with campaigns, things like that. 501c4, the donors don't have to be disclosed, but it's not a tax write-off to donate. There's rules around how much money you can or how you can spend your money to some degree. And but most organizations will have 5 or 6 groups at some point. I think the NRA has like 9 different groups, but usually at the center of those groups, you find a C4 or a C3. The C3 nonprofit, that's the one where you donate. Your name is listed to the IRS, but you also get a tax write-off, and they can't do political work. So the difference seems to me for USCCA to be that the center of your organization is this for-profit company, Delta Defense, that sells the insurance, which is the main attraction, as you mentioned earlier, for most people who become USCCA members. Whereas, the NRA, you could argue that the main reason people become members of the NRA is, in part at least, the political advocacy. So why is this a better formation? How do you explain this to people as to why it's going to be beneficial for the advocacy side of things and not a detraction?
I would say Delta Defense has, as a for-profit business, the leadership of Delta Defense has really stepped up to make a massive financial commitment and really an investment in their consumers and in the protection of the Second Amendment through supporting these political advocacy efforts. And I think that is a differentiator. Delta Defense has committed to covering many of the operating costs and overhead expenditures of some of the political advocacy efforts. And so that's a huge win for the everyday gun owner consumer who's opening up their wallet and, providing resources and support to these organizations, because that means that money gets to go directly to the important programming and training and investment in the tools that are really for them, that are for the gun owners. And so I'd say it's a huge benefit. It's a huge asset that the leadership of Delta Defense has said, we're willing to have this financial support. We're willing to make these contributions because we believe so strongly in the importance of protecting the Second Amendment and making that investment that they're willing to do that. And so that is a massive differentiator. And we are thankful that Delta Defense has lent that support.
And are you confident that they're, obviously a for-profit business is there to make money. Are you confident that there's never going to be a conflict between that goal of, turning a profit and the political advocacy side of things? Do you think they will always be aligned in that way, or I mean, do you see any potential conflicts down the line that you might have to deal with on that front?
I don't, because they are separate and distinct entities. We have a board that's going to govern the Action Fund. We also have a board that governs the Super PAC that's working in the best interests of those entities. But often they are complementary, and they do go hand in hand because, again, a win for consumers, a win for the Second Amendment, less regulation, less onerous restrictions on your right to own a firearm is ultimately good for Delta Defense, but it's also good for the country. So there really is a built-in, I think, dual incentive system for both.
Okay. And so, I'm sure people looking around to decide where they want to put their money to best accomplish their goals if they're a gun rights advocate are going to wonder too about, your experience. Why should they trust your political judgment? So can you tell us just a little bit about your own background?
Sure. I have been in the political world realm arena for almost 15 years. I got my first start in politics. There was a businessman from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, running for Senate. He was running against the liberal lion of the Senate, Russ Feingold. No one really knew who he was, but we ran sort of this scrappy campaign and ended up winning. And of course, this was Ron Johnson in 2010. That was my first job in the political world. And from there, I've worked for many years on Capitol Hill for a variety of different senators, members, committees. I've worked on various campaigns. And after spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C., my husband and I made the decision that we wanted to get out of the swamp, get out of the Beltway, move back home to where I'm from, which is Wisconsin, and start a family. And this is when I came back and I found Delta Defense, and the USCCA was amazed at the growth of this company and of the organization based really in my backyard. And I was excited to kind of come on and help them begin to build out and grow this government affairs political advocacy space, because it's really something that they hadn't done a ton of prior to about 3 years ago. And I was excited because we came in, and again, we have this incredible membership base. We have folks who are saying, please do this, and trying to create the roadmap and the way to do this, to do it right, to be strategic about it. Stephen, we're going to go slow. We're going to be deliberate. We want to be responsive to the membership. We want to do what's best for the country ultimately. And we believe that, more responsible gun owners, changing the perception of gun ownership, more individuals going through regular firearm training and education, taking on the civic, individual, personal responsibility to get involved. That's going to create a better society, safer communities, and that's ultimately our goal. So it's been a fun journey. I'm excited to be back in Wisconsin.
Okay, and just real quick on the resources aspect of this, I see a lot of potential here. All the things you just described. It's one of the groups that I've been following since, at least 2019, when the NRA started having its issues with corruption allegations and all that, and loss of membership and so forth. You look around and you do see USCCA as sort of this next, you have a nationwide firearm safety training program. You have a membership-based organization with dues-paying members. You have a nationwide reach. There certainly seems to be a lot of potential there. But obviously, it's like you said, you're going to grow slowly. And I wonder, the 2016, the NRA spent $50 million to help elect Donald Trump. They spent significantly less in 2020. They'll probably spend even less than that in 2024. Where do you guys see yourselves lining up in that money race as we get to this next election?
Well, I would say that is not our primary focus or the primary metric of success for us, is how much money we're spending or how much money others are spending in political races and elections. You and I could talk probably ad nauseum about strategic investment and dollar for dollar and where you should be putting money for specific political races. That is not what we're measuring success by. And that's not what's going to be our immediate focus. Our immediate focus is really on this grassroots activation, these in-person experiences, facilitating and creating these pockets of communities of gun owners who understand what's at stake and are willing to get involved. And that's where we're going to really focus and measure our success and the interest of gun owners by is as we look ahead to the next year, as we plan these in-person events. Again, all the things we talked about, activist training seminars and get out the vote registration campaigns and all those really great community-focused events. What's the reception? What's the interest? And that's really where we're going to be focused and where we're going to be measuring our success by.
Okay, so you're much more focused on activist training and get out the vote activation than you are on political ad spending, something like that. So what is the metric exactly that you're going to be looking at then?
We're going to be looking at the amounts of events we host, the amount of people that are turning out for these events, the amount of people that are signing up and participating in our petitions and our calls to action, that are mobilizing, that might be testifying as we organize, in state capitals, for example, testifying against bills or providing, we have a great advocacy tool where we're able to send letters to members of Congress, where we're able to facilitate meaningful contacts, phone, text, email, with elected officials. It's that sort of engagement and activation that we're going to be looking to our membership base and beyond to see how successful this is and the interest. And then, of course, we're also going to be looking to leaders in the firearms community. We've had a lot of interest and great reception and conversation from folks. We're looking to them, to not just words, but opening up their wallets and making this investment in the Second Amendment, in consumers, in the everyday gun owners who are often buying their products to say, we're going to help empower you and engage you ahead of 2024.
Okay. And we will certainly be following you guys as you attempt to do those things here at the Reload. So if people want to find out more about the Action Fund and what you guys are up to and how to get involved, how can they do that?
I would encourage folks to check out our website, the USCCA actionfund.org. Follow us on any of our social media, Twitter, Facebook, USCCA Action Fund. Again, you'll find us across those channels. Please follow us, engage, take a look. And we're always interested in folks' support. You can reach out to me directly from the website. There's contact there. If you're interested in hosting an event or having a conversation and helping to develop and build out this community, we'd love to hear from you.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to head over to our news update now.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing pretty good. Phillies won the wild card. They're on to the NLDS against the Braves. This is the weekly sports update here on the show that I'm sure everyone is tuning in for. Eagles are 4-0, although I will say, we're filming on Friday, so I watched Thursday Night Football while I was putting together the newsletter, which I always I have terrible time management and just don't ever have enough time. So I'm always putting the newsletter together. Like I'm usually finished by midnight or so. So I watched the whole game that way, writing the newsletter and watching the game. And it made me feel worse about the Eagles because the Commanders, who we barely beat in overtime, got destroyed by the worst team in football.
Yeah.
Right. The Bears. And of course, I picked up the Commanders defense for my fantasy team this week.
Oof.
Yeah, I stream my defenses. I just pick up whichever one's playing like the worst offense.
Yeah.
And I mean, after they played the Eagles fairly well, they go and get, what was it, 40 points to the freaking Bears? What, like,
give them their first win of the season? Yeah.
How does that happen?
Even my Broncos beat the Bears. That's
right. It's insane. It's insane. And so I think they put up negative points for me. So thanks, Commanders. Yeah. Great job. They got all these guys on their defensive line, and they're a joke.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. The change in ownership has not helped them, it seems. How are you doing?
I'm feeling the opposite because, as I just alluded to, my Broncos finally got a win on the season by beating the hapless Bears.
I'm sure
maybe aren't so hapless
from here.
Yeah, that's right. Super Bowl bound now.
Yeah.
That's good. It's finally got a dub. I finally can come out of a football weekend not completely just in disarray over the state of Colorado football. So
there you go.
It's a positive step.
There's a positive. Of course, I'm still super happy because the Phillies are pouring it on. You know, they swept the Marlins, and now, of course, we're going up against the Braves, which is like the best team in baseball.
Yeah.
But I will say that, especially the last series we played against them, they looked like the Phillies could beat them again. Like I'm not. Yeah, I definitely think we could beat them, especially with how hot the Phillies are right now.
Yeah.
And the Braves had to sit and wait. You know, the buy in baseball is not as valuable, I think, as in football. So, you know, you want to be that hot team coming into a series. You don't want to be sitting around waiting, and because those guys are used to playing like every day. Basically, it's kind of crazy. But so we'll see how those go. And then, you doing any shooting this weekend? You got any plans for that?
We'll see. I might have a bit of a busy weekend work-wise, but I've been trying the last couple of weekends to get to the range, and just something has come up every time and haven't been able to, but I would like to, because it's overdue. It's been, I think, 2 months since I've even gone to the range. So I'd like to do that.
Yeah. A friend sent me a new optic for the AR, so I have to try that out soon. I still have to get the optic on my 365X macro replaced. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. Like, I feel like I'm going to call SIG and complain, and hopefully they'll send me a replacement, but I don't think I could trust that Zero Elite anymore.
Right.
They have a new optic, I guess, that's higher end now. So I don't know if I should try and go with that one or just get away from SIG optics altogether and go to like Hollow Sun or somebody like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe the audience can tell me what they think I should do with that. Cause like, you know, Zero Elite, I don't know. Maybe it's just that one that was defective and just eats batteries, you know, once a month, or I've heard bad things about it generally. So I think it's probably not just mine. But it has messed up my whole carry regime here. You know, I'm back to carrying the Springfield XDS, which is old as heck and only holds 8 rounds in the magazine. So that was kind of defeated the whole purpose of why I upgraded with extra capacity. So I don't know. Also, I'm still. I think I already said this, but you know, I had to reschedule my DC concealed carry application. That was supposed to be the day that I went up to the farm because of that escaped murderer, and so I had to push back another 3 months because DC is a joke. The system is a joke. It's intended to make you, not want to actually get the permit as much as they can possibly do it. And so speaking of which, we have stories related to this, right? We can start off real quick with one of our stories before we get into the headlines because it relates to this. Maryland, their Bruin response bill, their concealed carry law, ran into some trouble this week, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's sort of the latest saga in the various formerly may issue states that have tried to evade or rebuke the Supreme Court's ruling in Bruin to pass mostly just like ubiquitous gun-free zones in their states. That's sort of been the common theme through all of these. There's some other, factors as well. But and once again, it was blocked by a federal judge who said that at least some of the, he didn't do it across the board, but many of the gun-free zones that were passed in Maryland's law likely violated the Second Amendment. So it was blocked.
Yeah.
So
very similar ruling to what we've seen out of New York, New Jersey, Hawaii, right? Where they pass these laws, they make everything a gun-free zone. They reverse the presumption for publicly accessible private property in what gun rights advocates have started calling this the vampire rule, which I actually enjoy that name because
it's funny.
It's funny because once it was explained to me what the heck it means. But I guess in vampire lore, right, in vampire mythology, for a vampire to enter your house, you have to invite them in. And so with the way this rule works, for somebody carrying a gun, you'd have to invite them into your store or your restaurant or whatever. And so that they've started calling it the vampire rule because of that. That is lost across the board everywhere.
Yeah.
Of course, all these laws are still in effect. So, unfortunately for the people living in these states, I'm sure it's been a bit of a roller coaster for them, although I imagine they expected things like this would happen after the Supreme Court ruling. But, they've had all these laws get struck down, but they remain in effect because of appeals and how the process works. And so, most of the people who live in these states are still basically unable to carry a gun legally.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're oftentimes in worse position than they were before, because you still have people who would occasionally be able to get a permit, or depending on where you live in the state, right? Like New York, upstate New York, you were much more likely to be able to get a permit, and it would give you access to more places before Bruin. So somewhat ironically, there are, in practice, fewer people who can actually carry in fewer places than before. So I can't imagine that's going to stay that way for very long, though.
Yeah.
The fact that these are all losing the lower courts, the circuit courts that don't like Bruin can delay things to some degree for a while, but it's unlikely that they'll be able to completely forestall rulings against these laws for very long.
Yeah. I think it's a good point to make, because, we've seen a lot of conflicting rulings on like hardware ban cases, for example, where, some courts in some states have been upholding them regularly. Some have been striking them down regularly. But it is interesting to note that these Bruin response bills have almost across the board, at the lower court level at least, been struck down. As you said, many of them are still in effect because of stays and whatnot while it's being appealed. But in terms of actual rulings, they've almost across the board been struck down several times now. So
yeah, they've fared even worse than the hardware ban stuff to this point, because you get more of a mix with assault weapons bans or magazine bans. You've had federal judges go either way on those oftentimes, but with the Bruin response bills have been much less successful post Bruin, which kind of makes sense, because they're not even really designed very well to stand up to the standard that was put in place by the Supreme Court. Honestly, I mean, was one of the things after Bruin that was most surprising to me, is that they went this direction, because of places like DC, where as much as they make it a very big hassle to get your permit, you can still get it, and it does actually let you carry in most places outside of the metro, which is a big impediment, and there have been lawsuits over that. But they also have, it's one of those things where they have a law that says you can't carry on metro, but nobody's ever actually been arrested with a permit for carrying on metro. So it's, the federal judges in this circuit have consistently held that nobody has standing because they haven't been arrested doing the thing that is illegal. Nobody has been arrested doing it. So, there are games like that can be played as well. But I was basically just surprised they didn't try to do what DC did, which is essentially push things up to the limit, make it may issue, but make it just 16 hours of training to get your permit, or make a number of gun-free zones around, but not to the point where basically you can't carry, which is what most of these Bruin response laws actually do, which has been the surprising part, because it's like, this isn't going to work. It's very difficult to see any way that these are going to survive scrutiny in the end. Whereas DC's law, it's more of like a micromanaging their law sort of issue, if that makes any sense. So, we're back to another one of these Bruin response laws getting a thumbs down from the courts again. And of course it will be stayed, and it was stayed when it was issued, and will likely be stayed pending appeal. And so unfortunately for people subject to these laws, you're still going to have to deal with them, but the direction in courts are positive for gun rights advocates, at least, not for the state or for gun control advocates.
Yeah.
So what do we got in headlines?
So over in the newsletter links, one interesting story comes to us from Courthouse News Service, where the state of Missouri, the government of Missouri, is appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court right now over their Second Amendment Preservation Act. It's sort of one of these Second Amendment sanctuary laws that it's probably one of the broadest in the country, especially at the state level, where the state of Missouri essentially attempted to nullify all federal gun laws that it says infringes on the right to keep and bear arms, and it levies a $50,000 fine or potential $50,000 fine for any state and local official that aids federal law enforcement in enforcing any of these laws that it considers to be unconstitutional. And that's been blocked by courts. And so the state is now asking the Supreme Court to step in and let it enforce this law.
Yeah. So here's the other side of the coin, right? From those broom response laws, where you look at a broom response law and you think, well, that's not going to stand up to scrutiny. And then you look at this flavor of Second Amendment sanctuary law that pushes into essentially nullification of federal law. It's one thing to say that we won't use local or state resources to enforce, gun laws that we don't think are constitutional. That is probably fine. It's almost certainly fine, but because the federal government can't force states and localities to enforce their laws, that's established by the Supreme Court. But where they cross the line is into nullifying federal law. I mean, this is kind of, we settled this at one point in American history. It was not a very pretty time. It was the Civil War. Right? This is what a lot of southern states had attempted to do in the lead up to the Civil War, is nullify federal laws and say they don't apply within the state borders. And yes, that's not something that is going to survive scrutiny, I think. And it's kind of, there's sort of two problems with it, right? With these laws as they've been passed. And that's one, that they're nullification, and that's just blatantly unconstitutional. You can't say that federal laws don't apply inside of your state. And then two, they're also super vague is the other problem with them, because they just say any law that's gun law that's unconstitutional, right? And they don't say which ones they think are unconstitutional. And so it could be any of them, really. And it's just they didn't put the effort into trying to outline what they would. These came up as like a pushback against confiscation. Mass confiscation is usually what you'll hear. Sometimes red flag laws will be the basis for these sanctuary provisions. But these state level laws tend to be a lot more vague and symbolic than that. They're just like, gun laws that are unconstitutional aren't in effect here. And well, which ones do you think are unconstitutional? Are any that currently exist unconstitutional in your mind? Like, what about, violent felons being barred from owning guns? That's a federal prohibition. Or domestic violence convicts. Are those, do you consider those unconstitutional? Probably not, right? Most people in most states would not think those aspects are unconstitutional. Obviously, there's plenty of fights over nonviolent felons, or even, obviously, the Supreme Court is taking up a law right now on domestic violence restraining orders. But, usually these were put in place for future looking laws of, if there was a mass confiscation effort undertaken by the federal government or something, then we wouldn't allow that to happen in our state. And that's kind of the symbolic thing they're trying to do. But unfortunately, the way it comes out creates all sorts of questions about what they consider to be unconstitutional gun laws, because it's not defined. And then it goes into nullification territory where it's not going to survive.
Yeah. Yep. I think that pretty much sums it up. One, the Supreme Court, I don't think is going to step in and put this into effect. But two, in the long run, I think, as you said, these nullification laws aren't going anywhere.
And they can also be really detrimental to the people that live in those states, because usually you see this was something that had started with silencers, right? That and not really a nullification law, but it's sort of an attempt to claim that as long as you make a silencer and sell it within state borders, I believe it was Kansas that did this.
Texas as well.
Well, yeah, but I think there was maybe it might have actually been Missouri initially. I can't recall off the top of my head, unfortunately, but there was a state that tried to. There have been a couple states since then that have tried this, but in a bit more responsible manner. But initially, one of the first ones to do this was trying to claim that, as long as you make and sell the silencer within state borders, federal law doesn't apply to that manufacture and sale. And so you don't have to register it with the ATF or pay the tax stamp or do all this stuff under the National Firearms Act. And the problem with that law is that it was clearly passed to be a symbolic gesture. And this is another problem that you run into. Like, if you're in a state that has a lot of pro-gun policies and they kind of run out of things to do next, they start doing stuff like this where it's meant to be symbolic, but if you take them seriously, you could end up in jail, which is exactly what happened to a couple guys who followed their state's silencer law and ended up being arrested and prosecuted, because that's not how the law works. The state cannot nullify federal laws. It also was done under this theory that the NFA is justified by interstate commerce clause, which obviously a lot of conservatives have issues with, perhaps legitimate issues with, but that's not what the NFA is justified under anyway. It's a tax. The NFA is a tax. The government has broad taxing authority, and it didn't work, and those people went to jail. And this is some of the sort of byproduct of passing laws like this. Is if you tell people, if your state government tells you that, oh yeah, it's perfectly legal, don't listen to the feds, and then the feds show up at your door and arrest you, it doesn't matter what your state politicians said when they passed this bill.
Right.
And really these lawmakers should be challenging it themselves. And I guess, to be fair to Texas, that is how they had set up their version of the silencer nullification bill, where they told people it wasn't going to be in effect until the state filed a lawsuit, and if they won the lawsuit, it would go into effect. So there has been at least some effort to keep this from happening again with lawmakers in these states. But these sorts of bills end up creating a lot more problems, I think, than they do any good. It's just another thing where when it passes, just like a broom response bill, you're like, this isn't going to hold up in court. It's just not.
Sure.
Anyway, what's our next story?
Yeah. On to the next. This link I wanted to include just because there's a little personal hook here for me. So the AR company that some of you listeners may be familiar with, Wyndham Weaponry up in Maine, is officially going out of business. And they were a relatively small gun maker. It was started by the former folks that ran Bushmaster before Bushmaster sold in 2011. And so they retooled up and just opened up under the Wyndham name. But that was actually the first AR I ever bought when I was 21 years old. It was my first starter AR. And that's sort of what they were known for, is sort of good, basic, good quality budget ARs. And so they're officially going out of business. So one less AR maker on the market.
Yeah. The founder passed away in March, I believe.
Yeah.
And it can be hard to continue momentum of a small business like that when the founder leaves, and plus you're in a bad market right now for ARs, and really guns generally are pretty well down. There was by the way, just another slight headline update here. There was another year-over-year decrease in gun sales last month, although the good news, I guess, for the industry, if you can point to any, is that the decrease was smaller than the previous 2 months before that, because I think it was like a 20% drop year over year for July, and so it's down to an 8% drop in September. So perhaps the rate of decline is slowing. That's at least something. And we did see, obviously, we wrote about Smith & Wesson finally recovering to the point where they actually had a profitable quarter for the first time in a while. Well, a quarter where they weren't, where sales increased instead of decreased year over year. So perhaps we're finding the bottom of the market, but it's certainly not what it was 2 years ago. That's for sure.
Yeah. And the last link we'll talk about before we head over to our final story is comes from the Detroit Free Press. It's sort of an interesting look into how states and prosecutors are handling the parents of school shooters. So this deals with the Oxford High School school shooter in Michigan. And the Michigan Supreme Court just allowed the prosecution of that school shooter's parents to go forward. They're facing involuntary manslaughter charges because they bought the gun for their son that he eventually used to carry out this mass shooting. And it's just interesting to see, because I think this is the first of its kind where the parents of a school shooter are being criminally prosecuted.
Yeah, they bought the gun. They also, I guess the idea is that they ignored a number of red flags that he was potentially going to carry out this attack. I mean, it seems like the school could also be held somewhat accountable for these things, but he had drawings about where he's fantasizing about carrying out killings, and there were, there's various comments that he made to his parents, and they didn't do, I guess the accusation is that they didn't do enough to intervene to prevent this. And so they're being charged alongside him, which is, it is pretty remarkable. You haven't really seen that before. And it does have a lot of implications down the line, I think, for not just mass shootings, but all sorts of things where when minors commit crimes or violent crimes or murder, whether their parents can be held responsible for that legally is sort of a really big question, I would think. You also kind of saw this in Virginia with the elementary school kid who got a hold of his mother's gun and shot his teacher. I think that was a little bit different because I think they weren't necessarily charging her for the actual shooting itself. I think they brought her up on with the Hunter Biden charge, the drug use charge, and it seems like kind of just we're going to throw something at you for this, even if it's not directly related. So there does seem to be more of an appetite among prosecutors now to try and hold parents accountable when their children commit school shootings. I don't know. We'll see this. I don't know if this is going to work in Michigan. I mean, these people have been in jail for 2 years already, pending just the trial in this case. So we'll see how it goes. And it's pretty interesting. I wonder how the public at large feels about that. I'm sure a lot of people would hold them responsible given how they ignored some of the signs that this could happen, I guess, and that they claim that they didn't know he had the gun. Obviously, they claim that they kept it secured away from him, but obviously that security wasn't very good. So I don't know. It's a very unique and novel case from my understanding. I don't recall any of these for other incidents in the last 20, 30 years at least.
Yeah, it's certainly a trend we'll stay on top of too, because it does have some big implications, like you said. The final story we're going to talk about today is a court ruling on the latest court ruling on the ATF's pistol brace ban, where for the first time we now have a district judge issuing an injunction not on administrative procedure grounds, but actually on a finding that they may be covered by the Second Amendment. If you want to talk about that ruling that you wrote up.
Yeah, big change here, right? Because we've talked about these cases, the ATF rules, the President Biden's unilateral action on gun policy, where he's trying to ban these different things. And those have mostly been stopped, including, and President Trump before him with the bump stock ban. And all those had been stopped on APA grounds, Administrative Procedure Act grounds, like essentially that the ATF doesn't have the authority to do these things, instead of the fact that the idea that these accessories and firearms are covered by the Second Amendment. That's a totally different argument that hasn't really come up in these cases, at least not in the rulings against the ATF. So that's a pretty big sea change in this case. And now you have Judge O'Connor, Reed O'Connor. He's been involved in this case from the beginning against the pistol brace ban in the Fifth Circuit. And he actually initially denied, if you remember all the way back, the first ruling from him was denying the injunctions against this rule. And then the Fifth Circuit panel of the appeals panel granted them. And so now he has to go back and relitigate this stuff under their reasoning. And so But he came to the conclusion that yes, pistol braces or braced pistols, firearms that have pistol braces on them, are in fact protected by the Second Amendment, and that they are, more importantly, in common use for lawful purposes. Right. That was sort of the bottom line of what he found, and therefore they can't be banned or restricted in the way that the ATF wants to do that. And that has a lot of implications, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because he drew on a lot of the findings during the when the regulatory rulemaking was going on, sort of the findings of the ATF's estimates of how many braces that were out there. He used the lower end estimates, it's the 5 to 7 million or whatever, maybe 4 to 7 million, 3 to 7. Yeah. And obviously we've seen the Congressional Research Service estimate could put it up as high as 40 million potentially. But either way, him narrowing down on that 5 to 7 or 3 to 7 rather million braces and saying that represents, a commonality for, use among law abiding people, you wrote about in a members piece, has huge implications, not just for pistol braces, but for all sorts of Second Amendment hardware ban cases, right?
Absolutely. And by the way, he also cites our reporting when he was considering whether to issue this injunction because according to the ATF, from what they told us, they'd only registered, I think 250,000 of these, or maybe 750,000. I can't remember. It was about 8% registration rate, going off the low end estimate of how many are out there. And so part of his point was that there are a lot of people still, specifically FPC members, that, they got into the whole thing of wanting to avoid a nationwide injunction, but also grant the widest possible relief to the plaintiffs in the case. And the plaintiffs in this case include the Firearms Policy Coalition and all of its members. And so he's sort of implying that a lot of FPC members probably have these guns and haven't turned them in and are now could be subject to prosecution without an injunction. So that's where he used our reporting in this case. The Fifth Circuit had cited our reporting previously as well. But the more important aspect is this idea that 3 million pistol braced guns, or braced pistols, or whatever you want to call them, qualifies as being in common use. That's important because the common use standard came up almost 15 years ago at this point in Heller, but it hasn't ever really been articulated as to what constitutes common use, right? You've had a couple things where judges have opined on this. You had Justice Alito in Saitano briefly talked about common use in regards to stun guns, where you put the estimated number as low as 200,000 of those. And he said that makes them in common use because they're available all over the country and there's hundreds of thousands of them and, owned by people who are law abiding. And so, you had that, but that's one justice in a concurrence. And so anytime you get a new case where a judge is opined on this topic, what exactly is common use, I think that's extremely important and very relevant. Now, look, he puts it in the millions. Millions was sort of the bottom line for him. Yeah, he cites the 3 to 7 million, but he just says millions owned by people that the ATF admits themselves were law-abiding, that bought them legally at the time. And so that, to him, that puts them in common use, which makes them protected under the Second Amendment, which means you'd have to have some sort of with Bruin, you'd have to have some sort of historical tradition of barring commonly used firearms like this, which doesn't exist. And so therefore, you can't ban them. You can't heavily restrict them the way the ATF wants to do. And I think this creates huge implications for, every hardware ban basically, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
I went through all of them in that members piece, and, there's sort of variations in how many there are and how accurate or how reliable the estimates of those devices are. You start off with magazines, which you've got almost certainly the most magazines that are affected by these high capacity bans, even though the definition of what high capacity means changes from state to state, sometimes from gun to gun within the state, right?
Yeah.
I think Washington has the Washington and Oregon, they set a different standard for handguns and rifles for some reason. Yeah. And then, but yeah, it could be 10 rounds, it could be 15 rounds, it could be 12 rounds, 17 rounds, it changes. And there's really no way to know how many are out there because nobody keeps records of magazine sales. They're not usually serialized devices, so you couldn't figure it out even if you wanted to. And the best estimates that I've seen are like, I think plaintiffs in magazine ban cases have used 115 million, right, as one estimate. So they're probably the most numerous of the things that get targeted for bans, right? And that, certainly even if you're an order of magnitude off, they're going to be in the millions. Then you go to ARs, right? So-called assault weapons. Again, you have the same definitional issues where an assault weapon in California is not the same thing as an assault weapon in Maryland. And you have a little bit more reliable estimates because they're based on an industry analysis by the National Shooting Sports Foundation of ATF reports on manufacturing records, but the manufacturing records don't really get into like the exact models that are made. They're more broad than that, but they are at least sort of required reports manufacturers have to hand in to the ATF of how many of a particular kind of gun they made or class of gun. And then the NSSF goes from that to try and figure out how many are out there. They put that number at 24.4 million. Really ARs and AKs is what they're looking at. Assault weapons laws usually apply to a much broader swath of weapons than just ARs and AKs too. But regardless, even if that's way off, you're still probably well into the millions there. And then you get to silencers or sound suppressors, right? And that's where you get the most reliable estimate because every suppressor, as we kind of went over earlier, has to be registered with the ATF under the National Firearms Act. And so you have probably a pretty exact count of how many of those exist. And last report that the ATF put out, I think it was 2.6 million registered, and that was in May of 2021. So they're probably more than that now. They might have reached that 3 million mark. That is the low end estimate of braced pistols from the ATF. So, that also calls into question perhaps the NFA itself because of the fact that it's trying to restrict these commonly owned devices, silencers. Now, there is, of course, with magazines and silencers, there's going to be this side debate about whether they're arms or not.
Right.
And that's still a live legal debate. And that's how a lot of these the magazine bans that we've seen upheld, as you wrote about in a member's piece not long ago, I think last week, actually.
Yep.
That's often how they're upheld by claiming that high capacity magazines aren't arms that are protected by the Second Amendment, even if there are a lot of them out there.
Right.
And then they also get into a different standard of common use, right? The Judge O'Connor uses a standard of commonly owned, essentially, and people own them for self-defense, right? That's often the intention of people who buy these devices and firearms. But the standards we've seen from judges who have upheld magazine bans, they say common use for self-defense. And what they mean by for self-defense is literally you have to fire more than 10 rounds in a self-defense encounter for it to count as being used for self-defense. So that's where things start to diverge on the court level. Although I would imagine the Supreme Court is probably siding with the O'Connor view of this over the other view. So we'll see though. We'll see how it plays out.
Right. Yeah. It depends. Obviously this is just a district court judge, so this isn't precedential or anything like that. But like you said, it's a very interesting argument. It's the first time we've seen this now in these ATF rule cases. And if it's an argument that takes off with other judges and potentially higher level circuit court judges, could see that becoming precedent and very influential going forward. So.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what, honestly, gun rights advocates have been waiting for 15 years since Heller was handed down, and what gun control advocates have been fearing for 15 years. And it hasn't happened yet, right? So Even after Bruin, we haven't, the Supreme Court certainly hasn't gotten involved yet. We haven't seen a lot of these hardware ban cases make it into final decisions at the appeals court level, the circuit court level yet. So there's still going to be some time, I'd imagine. And, maybe it'll take another 15 years. It's not a guarantee, but you are starting to see more of this outcome, this logic running through the courts now. And I do think that it will probably continue in that direction, and it won't be very long at this point before you do start seeing those hardware bans get knocked out in higher court rulings, and potentially at the Supreme Court sooner than later. But that's all we've got for this week. We will be back again real soon. If you like what you hear on this show, if you enjoy our reporting, if you value it, please head over to thereload.com and buy a membership today. That is how we can do any of this. Our operation is completely member funded. It is independent. We are not owned by any large corporate conglomerate or whatever. We don't have sponsors. We have members, and they're the people who fund our reporting. So if you head over and join today, you will, of course, also get exclusive access to some of these analysis pieces we've discussed. There's hundreds of pieces that you will find as a member you can't find anywhere else. You'll also get access to the member newsletter that comes out on Sunday, in addition to our free newsletter that comes out on Fridays. And you'll get access to this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show. If you are already a member and you want to be on the show, just reply to your members newsletter and join us. We love talking to members and hearing from them about their backstory. It's always interesting. And of course, you can support us in other ways. If you don't want to buy a membership right now, you can like this show on YouTube, leave a comment, share it with your friends and family who might be interested in it. Leave us a review. Those things all help the show grow as well. And we are continuing to grow, which is always great. And that's all we've got. We will be back again real soon. Thanks, guys.
Oh, the devil